Ladies and gentlemen, we will now begin panel 3 of the conference, which is entitled Infrastructures Underground, Pipelines and Politics. The chair for this panel will be MAI's Deputy Director, Michelle Teo. For your information, Michelle has more than 20 years of experience in both the government and the private sector in the fields of international relations and corporate/digital communications. She spent a substantial number of years in the Foreign Service and has officially served as Singapore's Deputy High Commissioner in Australia. She then joined IBM first as a communication leader with IBM Singapore and later with IBM ASEAN. Without further ado, I would like to hand over the proceedings to Michelle.
Well, welcome everybody. Wayne has, of course, now revealed my age. I'm telling people that I've had more than 20 years experience. Let me welcome our 3 panelists. We're running a little bit behind time. Everybody's been wonderful and they've all said they're going to stick to the 20-minute deadline. So what we will do is we will have Andre speak first, followed by Serik, and then by Lee Chen. I will introduce each person very quickly. When we will leave the Q&A to the end, when you ask your question, please identify yourself and which speaker you are addressing the question to. I'll repeat that again at the end. To the next presentation, which is by Assistant Professor Serik Orazgaliev, who is from the Nazarbayev University Graduate School of Public Policy. I think Serik is not unfamiliar with Singapore, having spent a year here with us at the Lee Kuan Yew School of Public Policy. He is going to talk about competition for pipeline export routes in the Caspian region, which I think is a nice way of following on from what Andre has actually talked about and some of the geopolitical implications. We can come back to that later on during the Q&A. Let me now give the floor to Serik.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. And earlier today, I think Professor Marsden talked about Silk Roads, old and new. And Silk Roads are concepts and theoretical frameworks often used to analyze social, economic, and trade relationships. So from the international relations perspective, the Silk Road framework is a liberalist framework because it emphasizes mutual benefit and it emphasizes cooperation and trade. Talking about Caspian region and energy cooperation in the Caspian region, the general trend is that the energy cooperation in the Caspian region was mainly analyzed through the realist frameworks. And one of them is the old great game and then the new great game. And we know that realism sees the world politics as the field of conflict between the parties pursuing power and influence. And this paper is trying to analyze the Central Asian energy cooperation and trying to see whether this framework of old great game and the new great game is really relevant, or whether the two frameworks, one of the new Silk Road, which is the liberalist, should be used in conjunction with that, because there is not only conflict going on in the Caspian region, but there is, as we will see, and I'll try to describe this briefly, there is a cooperation going on, and also the newly independent Caspian states themselves, they are becoming actors in the region. So the competition for energy resources in the Caspian Sea was seen as a new great game, and for which Caspian region and Central Asia had been the playground. And of course the concept is introduced by Kipling, and it takes its name from the strategic rivalry between British and the Russian empires in the 19th century. But in the aftermath of the Soviet dissolution, the new great game in the Caspian region involved multiple actors, such as big global actors such as China, Russia, and the United States, but also regional actors such as Turkey and Iran. and the newly independent Caspian states, Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, and Turkmenistan themselves becoming an actors in this new great game. And of course, the global players, they had their own agendas, often competing. So the United States introduced its East-West energy corridor, which diverts energy resources of the Caspian region, bypassing China, Russia, and Iran. Moscow has been attempting to maintain its influence using different mechanisms. And one of the frameworks is regional integration by Eurasian Economic Union. China is a latecomer in the Caspian region because its investments started pouring into the region since late 1990s. In fact, of course, before, within the framework of Shanghai Cooperation Organization, China was engaged in the region, but Shanghai Cooperation Organization is mainly focus is on security issues. So in 1997, China's CNPC first entered Kazakhstan, and this didn't happen until China and Kazakhstan signed an agreement under which China promised to invest into the new pipeline from West Kazakhstan to China. And after that, Chinese multinationals increasingly started acquiring assets in the Caspian region. And of course, in 2013, China's initiative, One Belt, One Road, was announced in Kazakhstan during President Xi Jinping's visit to Nazarbayev University. So, second slide. So, right after the collapse of the Soviet Union, the newly independent Caspian states found themselves in a difficult situation because they heavily relied on the Russian pipelines to export their oil and gas to global markets. And it may not be that the USSR intentionally built the pipelines in such a way, but it's that during the Soviet times, the Caspian states used their energy resources for domestic use, and then Siberian oil was mostly exported to international markets. So in the post-1991 period, global and regional powers pulled the new Caspian states in different directions, and in 4 directions. Actually, it's a western route lobbied by the United States and the European Union, was designed to deliver gas and oil from Caspian states through Georgia and Turkey. The second route was, of course, the southern route, which was projected to be through Iran towards the Persian Gulf, and this is the shortest route, of course, but it wasn't implemented for various reasons. The eastern route offered by China was, by the beginning of 21st century, it's turned into one of the biggest energy consumers. So from 1997, China is increasingly acquiring assets in the region. And of course, the northern route, which Russia offered to Azerbaijan and Kazakhstan to access a Novorossiysk port in the Black Sea. So as I said, all the global players, they had their own agendas, and I'll briefly discuss Russia and US and China's participation in the region. So on Russia, I will not talk a lot about Eurasian Economic Union, but Russia's involvement and role in the dispute of the Caspian Sea, on the legal status of the Caspian Sea. So briefly on the dispute, before 1991, there were only 2 riparian states around the Caspian. It was only USSR and Iran. And since the collapse of the Soviet Union, suddenly there were 5 littoral states. And of course, they had to redefine their maritime borders. And it wasn't an easy task because 2.5 decades, still there is no unilateral agreement signed by all parties. Of course, there are bilateral agreements, but there is still no agreement on the legal status of the Caspian Sea. And why it is important? The parties, they could not agree on whether the Caspian is a sea or whether the Caspian is a lake. And why it is important is because if the Caspian is a sea, then it's regulated by the United Nations Convention on close, and the riparian states would have their national sectors in the Caspian Sea, which would give them the sovereignty to exploit the resources. If the Caspian would be defined as a lake, then the international law provides cases where the lakes are used commonly by states, and which was, of course, rejected by all newly independent Caspian states such as Kazakhstan, Turkmenistan, and Azerbaijan, because they didn't want to share their resources, which are mostly found in the northern part of the Caspian Sea, with Iran and other southern states. So the dispute, it is understandable why the dispute is still going on, and the parties cannot agree. There were, of course, arguments that Russia doesn't want the dispute to be resolved because if it's resolved, then the Trans-Caspian pipeline will be constructed, which will take the Caspian oil to the west, to Europe. But not only Russia, but Iran was also rejecting the proposals to divide the Caspian into national sector. And at some point in 1991, I think Iran employed its military vessel to force out Azeri exploration company from the disputed areas in the Caspian Sea. Of course, there was no military conflict, but immediately Turkey and the United States reacted, supporting Azerbaijan and promising Azerbaijan full support, financial and military. But eventually, the area is still not developed, although there is oil in this disputed area. But of course, it doesn't allow foreign investment and the multinational companies to come and explore these areas. So Russia had Caspian states relied on Russian pipelines, as you can see, and the old pipelines. So Kazakhstan had a pipeline from Atrau to Samara, and Azerbaijan used Baku-Supsa pipelines. And Russian Lukoil is active in some of the projects in Kazakhstan, such as Tengiz, and in Azerbaijan in pipeline projects. But the problem of the pipelines to Russia was that they had limited capacity, and also they were outdated. As you can see, this Central Asia Russia pipeline was initially constructed in the 1960s. So there was a need to construct new pipelines, and this is where the global players started to compete for the directions of these pipelines. So the United States, it had its own agenda, so it introduced its Suez Energy Corridor initiative, and its multinationals were quite active. ExxonMobil and Chevron have dominating shares in projects in Kazakhstan, and also it's related to the hype of the Caspian bonanza that in the 1990s these companies claim that there is enough oil for everybody and there is no need to compete. And U.S. endorsed its Baku, Tbilisi, Ceyhan, and South Caucasus pipelines to get to enable these multinationals to export this oil. Right? And China, as I said, it's a latecomer in the region from the late 1990s. Its multinationals increasingly started to acquire assets. CNPC bought stake in Kashagan mega project, but also in Aktobe Menagas and Mangistau Menagas. And importantly, China has constructed the longest at the time oil pipeline in the world, from all the way from West Kazakhstan to China, and also the longest gas pipeline, which connects three Central Asian states, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, and Kazakhstan, with China. Briefly on the Caspian states. For Azerbaijan, it had old pipelines, but it was in need of building new pipelines, and eventually it chose to construct BTC, primarily because there was funding for that from the World Bank and from the US financial organizations. So Azerbaijan's first major pipeline was BTC, Baku-Tbilisi-Ceyhan, that's for oil, and for gas, there was Baku-Tbilisi-Erzurum, or South Caucasus pipeline. And interestingly, as I mentioned in the beginning, there is not only competition but cooperation. As you can see from the list of shareholders in the pipeline, South Caucasus pipeline, there are companies from the United Kingdom, but also from Iran and Russia here. For Kazakhstan, as I said, Kazakhstan had only one major pipeline in 1991 from Atyrau to Samara, and it had options but lacked money. So eventually, with the finances of multinational companies, the pipeline was built from Aktau to Novorossiysk, from Tengiz field to Novorossiysk here. And again, if we look at the shareholders, there is Russian companies, Lukoil, and then the US companies, ExxonMobil and Chevron. And the pipeline itself goes through the Russian territory. So this is why I emphasize that it's not only competition going on, but also in the trade there is a cooperation. And finally, China. I mentioned the Kazakhstan-China oil pipeline. It was constructed mainly by the financing from the China side in 3 stages. And then another major project, gas pipeline, from connecting Caspian states with China. And there is a link missing here. So there is a connection from West Kazakhstan to this pipeline, which enabled Kazakhstan also to gasify its southern region, because before Kazakhstan was purchasing gas from Uzbekistan, but now thanks to this pipeline, Kazakhstan's southern region have access to gas, but also Kazakhstan is planning to gasify its capital, Astana. Just this year it was announced. So this is Central Asia, China, Central Asia center pipeline to Russia. So this is Turkmenistan's old pipeline, and the proposed pipelines, as you can see, there are 2 proposed Trans-Caspian pipelines, and I'll talk about this a little bit later. But suffice it to say that one of them is from Aktau, connecting Baku and Aktau, and then one from Turkmenistan and connecting Baku and Turkmenbashi. And of course, TAPI, Turkmenistan, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and India pipeline. In 2015, the parties finally agreed to build this pipeline. It was delayed several times, and it was projected to be constructed by end of 2018, but it is likely that it will be delayed. But it's one of the ways how Turkmenistan also diversified in the eastern direction. So talking about the frameworks from which I started in the very beginning, how the new great game is different from the old great game. As I said, the old great game involved only 2 actors, Russia and the British Empire, but the new great game involved multiple actors, including the global major players such as the United States, China, and Russia, but also the regional players, because Turkey was competing because, of course, from having a transit pipeline on your territory, it brings transit fees, and Georgia was competing for this pipeline, for BTC pipeline, and it had succeeded in its offer to build the pipeline to its territory. So there are regional players, but also, secondly, so first, its object of competition, it was for territories, and for influence over these territories, but now it's for the energy resources. And secondly, it used to be conceived as a zero-sum game, but as the examples of pipelines in multiple directions show, it's not a zero-sum game anymore, and moreover, there is a room for cooperation for these countries in this region. And thirdly, the newly independent Caspian states themselves had become important actors because they had to choose from which pipelines to invest into or from which pipelines to agree to be invested from the multinationals. So it involved the active participation in the energy cooperation in the region. And my final slide is about challenging the existing narrative. So the new great game is about geopolitical rivalry and competition for power. But as we see, it's not only about competition, but about the mutual interest. Because all Caspian states benefited from diversifying pipeline networks, benefited economically and politically, became more independent. And so there is a mutual benefit which is more in line with the liberalist frameworks. Of course, there is we cannot reject the realist frameworks totally because there is a competition going on, and we could see it when the multinationals were competing to enter energy projects in Kazakhstan and Azerbaijan, but it doesn't include the cooperation that is going there. And finally, I made this point yesterday after discussing with conference participants that it was announced that on the 12th of August, almost 1 month from now, there is going to be a Caspian Summit in Aktau in West Kazakhstan, which is Aktau is a port in West Kazakhstan in the Caspian Sea. And in this Caspian Summit, it was announced that finally the agreement between all 5 Caspian states is going to be signed on the delimitation of the maritime borders in the Caspian Sea. So I'd like to end with a question on why finally the dispute of the Caspian status was signed after 2.5 decades, after 65 intergovernmental meetings that didn't bring any result, but suddenly this year the agreement is going to be signed. Is it the result of rapprochement of the northern tier between Iran, Turkey, and Russia? This is the question that I'd like to pose in the end so that we can have a discussion later. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Serik. Interesting, the first 2 talks that we've had, you talk about pipelines and pipelines that are new, pipelines that are old, talking about capacity. You can talk about networks. Those networks follow those pipelines. It's very interesting. Listening to our 2 speakers, one who looked at the statistics and gave you what is going on in terms of traditional suppliers, traditional markets, new players coming onto the market, and that sort of new sort of jostling. And then you look at what Serik talked about in the Caspian Sea, and you look at people who might traditionally have been rivals, but they also have other common interests. And so those interests shift, and the rivalry shift based on the dynamic on the ground, the requirement for resources, etc. I think that's very interesting. Let me now introduce our last speaker, Dr. Lee Chen Sim, who is the Assistant Professor and Chair at the Department of Social Sciences at Zayed University in the United Arab Emirates. She's a specialist in contemporary Russian politics, particularly looking at the Russian oil industry and its impact on the country's politics. Her talk today is going to look at Russia-Gulf relations beyond the pipelines and tankers. I think it is an understudied topic, and it's something that actually adds a different dimension to what we've been discussing already this afternoon on this panel. So let me just welcome Lee Chen. You have the floor.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and thanks to all of you for staying for the last presentation of the last panel on the day. Thank you very much. Now, when I flash this topic to my students, I often ask them, okay, what do you know about Russia? Clearly, they know about the Gulf. So I ask them, what do you know about Russia? And the first thing they'll tell me is, and bear in mind these are female students, so the first thing they'll tell me is, we know a lot about Russia. Okay, go on. And they'll say, well, Putin, right? on a horseback, or ice fishing or hunting, right? And they all get very excited, and then the room just, erupts and stuff. And I said, okay, calm down. Not talking just about that. Let's talk about Russia-Gulf relations. And they're like, okay. So then I asked them, right, can you tell me something about Russia-Gulf relations, right? Forget about the image of Putin, just Russia-Gulf relations. And then they said, okay, look, and this is their response. One of two responses. The first thing that some of them will say is that, look, why do you want us to study this topic, right? Obviously, according to them, they have very limited relations because they have very similar economic structures, right? Similar economies, they export same things, so clearly it's very similar structure. There's not much complementarity, and as you know, in international trade, that's not really a basis for strong trade relations because, both of them are exporters of the same product, fossil fuels. So it's just like carrying coal to Newcastle, or as we say, you're just like trying to sell sand to the Arabs. Okay, clearly a non-starter. Then some of my other students will say, well, look, no, actually we think that it's interesting because there's competition between the two of them since they export energy. And as you've heard from Andre, there is a lot of competition between, say, Russia and Qatar, for example. But, I would like also to try to amend this a bit, and as the other speaker has mentioned, there is also cooperation between these energy partners. It's not just competition, all right? So I'm going to try to tease out a little bit and go beyond just the energy perspective. Clearly, there's a lot of cooperation. They cooperate in the oil output deal between Russia and OPEC. So there is cooperation, right? But let's try maybe to go beyond just the energy markets and see what kind of a more richer, multifaceted relations there are between Russia and the Gulf. Now, if I were to ask you for a show of hands and I say, right, what is your perspective of Russia? Is Russia a revisionist power? The one that tries to stir up trouble, revisionist power? Or is it more of a status quo power? Okay. Quick show of hands. Who thinks that Russia is a revisionist power who's trying to change everything and upset the whole international order? Oh, nobody, okay. Who thinks that they are status quo powers? Okay. Again, not much response from anybody, so I assume that, you just like to have my response. Okay, fine, it's fine too. Now, most of my students feel that Russia is a more disruptive power, okay, that it tries to stir up trouble, that it's trying to change the world order into something that it favors more. Yeah, so that's what my students think, right? Now, what I feel is that Russia is actually, contrary to that kind of opinion, a rather more status quo power, right? Yes, they don't like what we call the liberal world order, but they like the world order. Okay, they don't like the liberal part of it, which they think is led by the US and West, but they like the world order. They like that they have a special place. The Russians have a special place because they're part of the P5 on the Security Council. They are seen as one of the world powers, so they like the world order in which they have a special privileged place, but not necessarily the liberal world order that is led by the states. So what do they want? What kind of interest do they have in the Gulf? Well, one of the things that Russia fears is colored revolutions, right? And I guess many of you would know what that term means, Arab Spring, colored revolutions. And colored revolutions are dangerous for Russia, right? Because they impact upon what is called its traditional soft underbelly, the part that is most vulnerable in Central Asia and in the Caucasus, right? So it's like a domino effect. And they don't want the same thing to kind of stir up any potential hint of an opposition in Russia itself. No one is saying that Putin's regime is going to collapse, but there has been demonstrations, unprecedented in scale, between 2011 and 2013, and there continues to be sporadic demonstrations on smaller scale in Russia, and a lot of allegations, blogs, everything about corruption, etc., some of which touches Putin. So they don't want any hint of any of these disturbances, bottom-up kind of disturbances, even feeding and blowing back into Russia itself, through the Middle East, through the Caucasus, through Central Asia. And so this is where the Gulf comes in, right? The Gulf with its links, all kinds of transnational, transregional human links to the region, to the Middle East, to the Caucasus, to Central Asia. This is where Russia hopes that it can leverage on the Gulf's influence in this region, all right, to bring some kind of stability to the Middle East, to the Caucasus, and ultimately to Russia itself. Right? Russia is also concerned about stability for another reason, not just colored revolutions, but terrorism. Right? As you can see from these two images, who is a terrorist, who is not. For Russia, they have come out very clearly to say there are no moderate terrorists. All right? There is no, choose one. No, according to them, there are no good terrorists, right? There is no moderate ones. So in that sense, quite a lot of their fear is this: if you have returning people who have fought overseas in Iraq and in Syria, you already have something like 4,000 Russian citizens fighting in the Middle East. Together with that, another 5,000 from Central Asia who have fought in this region. What if they come back to Russia? Okay? What if they come back to Central Asia? And there's quite a lot of Central Asians who work in Russia itself, in Moscow. What if you have these returning extremists who stir up trouble? There are already a lot of grassroots movements in Chechnya, in Uzbekistan, who are, who are had very long grievances against Russia. You don't want them to come back and make trouble, to blow up metro stations, bus stations, etc. So again, for Russia, they want to leverage upon the Gulf's relationship with some of these countries and these people-to-people networks to try to tame down regional instability in the region. Now, apart from regional instability, Russia is also very interested in this second point, to have it being recognized. To have it being recognized not just as a regional power, not just as a gas station, which some Americans had mentioned, okay, but also as a global power. And this for Russia is superbly essential. Okay? Russia's foreign policy for many decades, for many centuries, has been based on this idea of Russian greatness. Right? And so this is the kind of foreign policy framework they have. It's by virtue of their it's like in the US, you have a messianic mission. It's a very similar, Third Rome kind of idea in Russia, which many of you will be familiar with. So in this sense, Russia would like the Gulf to see it as one of these great regional powers and world powers. So what Russia has done is to try to put itself into many of these conflicts, because if you have your finger in a lot of pies, the Gulf is going to come back to you to try to get you to mediate between all sides. Russia is good friends with a lot of the conflicting parties in Syria, in Palestine, in Yemen, in Libya, and Iraq. It talks to everybody. It's not a foe or a friend of anyone. It's just, all-around good guy in that sense. So it's seen as kind of an arbiter, right? And in this way, it can increase its regional and global role because it's talking to all parties, right? So in this sense, then, if the Gulf recognizes Russia, and it does recognize Russia as a great regional and global power, there was a recent treaty, a recent declaration signed between UAE and Russia on strategic relations, and in which the UAE has recognized that Russia's got, an intrinsic role in the region. If you have the Gulf recognizing Russia's role, if you have the Saudis speaking more to the Russians, then you're going to get, other countries seeing that, hey, if they're doing that, then perhaps, we can see Russia as a great power as well. Okay? And don't forget that the Gulf states, of course, are traditional allies of the Americans. And if the Gulf states can have a shift in perspective, then, it kind of like behooves the others to rethink their position as well. Now, apart from those 2 points, obviously Russia and the Gulf have got a lot of cooperation as well on economic matters. We talked a lot about the energy-related issues, about cooperation in energy markets, but as well, they cooperate on the aspects that you see there. However, I'm not going to try to overplay this point because Russian Gulf trade is really very inconsequential. Yes, it has ballooned fantastically from something like 0.3 billion US dollars to 2.5 billion US dollars, which is nothing. Okay, in the whole grand scheme of things, it's something like 0.3% of each other's trade with the rest of the world. So yes, while it has mushroomed, it is not a great factor. Even weapons is not a big factor. Many people think that, oh, Russia must be supplying lots of weapons to the Middle East and to the Gulf. But in reality, Russia does not have very much of a foothold in the Gulf in terms of supplying weapons. Yes, it has supplied, a couple of tanks, some weapons, but this is minute compared to what the Gulf buys every year, hundreds of billions of dollars from the US and the West, Britain as well as France. So, it's worth it not to overplay that point. Although, of course, Russia would like to get a bigger foot into the door. Investments is interesting because these days there's been very much more investments, and I think this is the new thing about Russia-Gulf relations. They realize that they're not just competitors in energy markets, but they are partners that they can cooperate as well. They've been investing in each other's energy sector. For example, Qatar has just bought shares in Rosneft. UAE also has bought shares in Gazprom Neft subsidiary. So there are these kinds of cooperation. Saudis may be thinking of investing in the Yamal LNG plant, which Andre talked about. So there is all this kind of cooperation, right? New areas which are very interesting are potentially in nuclear power plants. That's one of Russia's comparative advantages, and it has potentially built up to about 16 nuclear power plants in Saudi Arabia. And UAE is huge now on space, again, a comparative advantage in Russia. So that could be a new area of cooperation. But what I'd like to kind of bring us to think a little bit about is there a military role for Russia in the Gulf, given that there's quite a multifaceted kind of relations, not just in energy, not just in cooperation on terrorism or regional stability. Is there then a role for Russia in the Gulf? We have seen Russia in Syria, right? So by extension, if Russia is in Syria, could Russia then have a bigger military role in the Gulf, which is traditionally an American area? And my answer to that question would be no, probably not in the short or medium term. And here's why I feel that's my response. Firstly, Russia, while it would like to reduce American influence in the Gulf, it actually would not like to do away with American influence, because America, as the power in the region, has actually brought a lot of stability and also prosperity by protecting the sea lanes. It has helped trade and everything to grow energy exchanges. So and Russia, with its investments and trade in that region, has benefited from that kind of stability that the US provides. So it is not interested in upending American influence. Surely it would like to minimize it, but not to completely do away with it. Because don't forget, if America leaves, then who is going to be the lightning rod for terrorists in the region, for terrorism, right? It would shift an uncomfortable spotlight from the US actions to perhaps Russian actions. Okay? So it's kind of useful for the Russians to have America still in the region. Secondly, the Gulf is also not a foreign policy priority for Russia. Russia's main interlocutor would be the US, and then it would be Europe, it would be the near abroad, the post-Soviet states. But the Gulf countries are like, somewhere right down there. Okay, it's not a big foreign policy priority. So it's not worth for Russia to expand its limited resources. And compared to the US, the Russians have a limited resource. Yes, it's been building up its military, but still, comparatively, it's not a big player in that sense. Okay? So if it has to expand its financial resources, military resources, might as well be an area where there's foreign policy priority in Europe, where of course you have a lot of Russian activity. And finally, Syria is not the Gulf. It is completely two different things. Syria was a very long time Russian and Soviet, ally. There were, lots of Russian advisors in Syria. They've had relations since the mid-1940s. They've sold arms to there. I think about 85% of the arms comes from Russia. They've got a port there. So it's very deep political and strategic relations and historical relations. Whereas the Gulf, it's a very, very new area. Most of the Gulf countries established relations only in the mid-1980s. So it's a very, very new area for them, and you can't compare the two spheres, Russia and the Gulf. And so I think that in the Gulf, Russia has very legitimate interests. It has very varied interests, but it can best protect its interests there, not by military means, okay, but by more non-military means. Okay, variety of economic, diplomatic, strategic, whatever you have it, but not military means. Okay, thank you.
Thank you.